Welcome to another edition of Breaking Politics at the end of a parliamentary week that's been dominated by the issue of jobs. It started on Monday with Toyota's announcement that it will end car making in Australia from 2017 and ended on Thursday with the release of unemployment figures showing that the jobless rate has hit 6%. Its highest level in a decade. That poses some pretty tricky problems for the Treasurer Joe Hockey, and shortly I'll be discussing what his options are with a panel of senior Fairfax political journalists. I'll also be talking to the Queensland Liberal MP, Wyatt Roy, and Amanda Rishworth, the Labor MP for Kingston in South Australia, who's got some observations about the controversy fronting Assistant Health Minister, Senator Fiona Nash. But as always, we start with our colleagues at Fairfax Radio who bring us right up to date. Michael Packey, welcome to the program.
G'day, Chris.
And what's happening this morning?
OK, well, this morning on our radio stations we've had the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and Treasurer Joe Hockey speaking about various issues. Obviously, they've been asked about the unemployment rate reaching this 10-year high, and the blame game is very much in earnest. The government blaming Labor's past 6 years in power for the result that we saw yesterday. And you had the Prime Minister and the Treasurer both encouraging the opposition and the Greens to get out of the way and support the scrapping of the mining and the carbon tax, saying that if these two taxes were gone, that would help manufacturers create more jobs.
So, Michael, the government's taken a pretty hard line with the car makers, with SPC Ardmona, the latest big corporation to come to Canberra seeking some sort of assistance has been Qantas. Now, in their interviews this morning, any sign of any softening there from the government? Well,
there appeared to be some softening from Tony Abbott on the foreign ownership question. Tony Abbott told Neil Mitchell that potentially Qantas should be unshackled, was his words, from some of the restrictions that it faces. And it appeared, this was just following in what Joe Hockey said yesterday, that this 49% cap that Qantas has on its foreign ownership is stifling the company. They did continue to defend to some extent, providing the airline with some sort of special assistance. They're still considering that, but it appears that special assistance will come in the form of a debt guarantee. But Tony Abbott this morning seeming to push this whole notion that Qantas should be unshackled from this foreign ownership limit or foreign ownership cap of 49%.
And Michael, looking ahead to the weekend, what do you expect to happen there?
Well, this weekend we've got Tony Abbott and the Agriculture Minister Barnaby Joyce. They're both travelling to parts of drought-affected New South Wales and Queensland. It's going to be a listening tour. That's what they're calling it at the moment. But no doubt that Barnaby Joyce will be in Tony Abbott's ear to provide some sort of assistance package to drought-affected farmers. One other thing I do want to say that Tony Abbott did tell Neil Mitchell this morning, and it relates back to the car industry, that the government may enhance the current $60 million package that's available to displaced Holden workers. Now, given Toyota's announcement on Monday to also shut its operations by 2017, there is room to move there and enhance that package to help those workers as well.
So maybe some small loosening of the purse strings.
Yeah, absolutely. Some small loosening of the purse strings for car workers and potentially for drought-affected farmers. OK,
Michael Packey, thank you very much for your time.
No problems.
Unemployment figures released on Thursday show that the jobless rate has climbed to 6%, the highest level in a decade. That has led to speculation that Treasurer Joe Hockey may want to take a more softly approach to the May budget. To discuss the jobless rate and the economic strategy of the government, we're joined by Liberal member for Longman in Brisbane, Wyatt Roy. Good morning, Wyatt.
G'day, mate. Thanks for having me back.
What's more important for the government in the budget? Getting the bottom line back in the black as soon as possible, or making sure that the budget provides enough stimulus to prevent unemployment going up further?
Well, I think the reality is that we can do both. And just first on the jobless figure, let me make the point that the former Labor government, when their last federal budget projected unemployment to rise to 6.25%. So this is effectively the legacy of the former Labor government. But I think that it's important as a Commonwealth government that we do two things. The first is that we respect taxpayers' money and we live within our means as a government. And I think you will definitely see that in the budget in May. And the second thing is that we get the private sector thriving and investing in this country. There is a fundamental difference between the two sides of politics. The coalition government believes that it is private enterprise, it is the private sector, small businesses that create jobs and wealth and prosperity, not the government. And we want to support them to do that by reducing taxes, reducing regulation, and giving them every opportunity to go out there and invest and employ more people. And on the other side, they believe that the government creates all jobs in this country. They don't have a concept that it's taxpayers' money that we're spending. And they have no real coherent economic narrative for the nation. And that's why you saw the demise that we saw in the economy under the former Labor government.
Yet for all the expertise in Treasury and the government and in private sector economists, everyone knows that the kind of magic element, if you like, in the economy is confidence. Very hard to measure, very hard to predict, but one would have to think that this week the confidence of many private firms has been battered by the news that Toyota is leaving, by the collapse of the mining services group Forge in Western Australia. Are you worried at all that confidence levels are taking a blow and that the government needs to at least send a message on this behalf?
Well, I think the government is sending a very strong message, and I think the Australian people are quite intelligent. They understand that we have to live within our means on the side of the budget. And to put it into perspective, if we don't do anything, the federal budget will reach a debt of $667 billion. That's $29,000 for every man, woman and child. And business owners understand that the Commonwealth has to live within its means. So I think that that's what we can do on the budget side. But in terms of creating confidence, that's why it's important the government invest in the things that the private sector is not necessarily best placed to do, and that is particularly on our infrastructure agenda. The Prime Minister has said he wants to be an infrastructure Prime Minister. We're putting enormous investment into particularly roads, and that is a productivity increasing measure that will help the private sector to thrive and prosper. The other strong signal that we're sending when it comes to confidence is that the Coalition is committed to reducing the tax burden and the regulation burden on businesses. That's why we want to scrap the carbon tax, scrap the mining tax, reduce red tape, and I would encourage the Labor Party to get on board with that legislative agenda and help send that message to the world.
Just on the issue of jobs, do you think the news there is going to get worse before it gets better?
Well, as I said, in the former government, under their last budget, they projected unemployment to rise to 6.25%. And the reality is you can't turn the economy around overnight. We do have to have significant reform of the amount of expenditure of government, and we do have to have reform in terms of lower taxes and lower regulation. So that will take time. It will take longer if the Labor Party continues to oppose our agenda. And what I would say is that the coalition government is steadfastly committed to reducing taxes, reducing regulation, so that the private sector can do what they do best. They can get out there, they can thrive, prosper, they can invest, and they can create jobs. And that is the commitment of this government.
Can we expect to have good jobs growth, though, by, say, the time of the next election?
Well, I would certainly hope so, and I could say that we would have stronger jobs growth with a coalition government than we would with a Labor government, because we are doing those things that I said about getting taxes down, getting regulation down, taking advantage of opportunities in our region. You saw the government sign a free trade agreement with Korea that amounts to $5 billion worth of investment in our country. Since we've been elected, the Environment Minister has approved over $400 billion worth of projects. So this really is a go for growth government, but it's going to be done on the back of the private sector, not on the back of borrowed money from taxpayers. And I think that that's a stark contrast to the Labor Party, which had completely lost control of its spending, had no coherent economic narrative for the nation.
Now, the Commission of Audit is going more or less line by line through government spending, seeing where savings can be made. Do you think that defence should be quarantined from budget cuts?
I do think that defence should be quarantined, and that's part of a responsible nation, particularly in our region. And the government has said that. So that's not to say that you can't find efficiencies or savings within defence, but my view is any of those savings, and the view of the government as well, as any of those savings that you might find in defence in various programs should be reinvested back into the defence budget. So overall, we ultimately hope to increase the defence budget over time, but if we are finding savings within the current budget, those savings should be reinvested back into the Defence Force, and I think that's a responsible thing to do as a first world nation that has a role to play on the international stage.
Now, we saw this week the Chinese Navy conducting exercises between Australia and Indonesia, closer to Australia than the Chinese Navy has been before, as I understand it. Does that raise concerns with you, or is it an indication of the changing strategic environment?
Well, the Asia-Pacific is a slightly changing strategic environment, that's true, but that also extends to the economic front as well. I mean, the economic rise of China has tied our two nations and the nations of our region closer together than ever before, and that, I think, is a great thing. And if there is one thing that would ensure the peace and prosperity of our region and the globe, it is actually global trade. And global trade has done more to increase prosperity for other nations than anything as well. It's done more to lift people out of poverty than anything else ever has. So that's why we are committed to those strong free trade agreements with China. You've seen we've already signed one with Korea. I would hope that we could potentially sign one with Japan and possibly the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So our region is more interconnected than it ever has been before, and that has huge opportunities for our nation as over 1 billion people come into the middle class in our region. They're going to want to buy our products, they're going to want to be educated here, and they're going to need a demand for our resources. And we're in a great place to meet that demand and get an economic benefit for our nation in the process. So, I don't think these military exercises, if you could call them that, really has a strong bearing on the fundamentals of the strategic alliances in our region.
Okay, just finally, the Prime Minister and the Agriculture Minister, Barnaby Joyce, are touring drought-hit areas this weekend, including in Queensland. Now, you're a Queensland Member of Parliament, but your electorate is in urban Brisbane. Is the drought in the Far West starting to impact there in Brisbane and people's attitude to what's happening?
Well, I'm also a farmer's son, so I sort of know the effects that weather can have on farming, and it is obviously having a serious impact. And I think sometimes with drought, people forget that it is a natural disaster in many senses. It's in many ways not that different to say a bad cyclone or a bad bushfire. It is an effect of nature on an extreme scale, and the government of both political persuasions have provided drought assistance in the past, and in the same way that we provide assistance after a cyclone or after a bushfire. And I think that that's pretty appropriate with extreme weather circumstances.
Is there a limit, though, to what the government can do in the present sort of budgetary circumstances? Clearly the Prime Minister is sympathetic to the plight of farmers, otherwise he wouldn't be going to visit them. But is there a limit to what the government can do, especially considering some of these farmers really are overburdened with debt running back from the previous drought?
Well, you're right. We're always taking into consideration the budgetary constraints. And as I said, if you look at drought as a natural disaster, I think that's the prism or the framework that we should work from. And you should have appropriate sort of measures that you might have for another natural disaster. Other ideas about the nature of farming are things that we can look at in terms of how we can make our farms more competitive and more globally, attracted to export markets. But in terms of the drought, it's a natural disaster, and we should provide appropriate assistance to natural disasters, whether it's floods, rain, or drought, whatever it might be. So I think that that would always be the prism that I would look at this. I think a discussion about the competitiveness of farmers and their profitability is probably a bit more of a separate issue.
All right, White-Roy, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me on. Cheers.
Assistant Health Minister Fiona Nash has been accused of misleading Parliament. This is over a decision to take down a healthy eating website. Senator Nash has experienced a torrid week in the Senate following the revelation that her Chief of Staff owned shares in a firm that lobbied on behalf of large food-making companies. Joining me now is the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Health, Amanda Rishworth. Morning, Amanda.
Good morning.
Okay, so what is the specific allegation against Senator Nash?
Well, look, I think there are some questions to be answered by Senator Nash about the conflict of interest that exists in her office. The star rating website is something that was agreed not just by the Commonwealth, but by states and territories. And at the final meeting, it was signed off, and a number of state ministers have said expected the website to go live. Of course, since that time, Senator Nash's Chief of Staff has requested that website be pulled, and it's now come to light that indeed he, at the time of the meeting, he owned shares in a lobbying company for the junk food industry that had opposed this measure. So it is unclear about the conflict of interest, and there's also my understanding that the Shadow Minister for Health made it very clear that there is a standing item on that agenda for any conflict of interest to be announced at that meeting. Now, that was not done in the December meeting. So there are real concerns about the Chief of Staff may have a conflict of interest. And what we've seen, unfortunately, from Senator Nash is a completely moving feast of explanations. First, she came into the Senate and said there was absolutely no conflict. She then had to come in and correct the record, but has not been given a full account of the conflict of interest and what she would do to resurrect this. Of course, we also know that Tony Abbott vetted every single staff member, and so there comes questions about whether or not he was aware of this conflict of interest and what he will do to direct Senator Nash to actually explain this.
Now, politicians and ministers often have a bit of wiggle room, but one area where there is no wiggle room at all is misleading Parliament. So where exactly has Senator Nash misled Parliament?
Well, look, I think what we've seen from Senator Nash is different explanations. First, she said there was no conflict. Then she came in and said, OK, there might have been a conflict. But then she's also given different explanations about why the website was taken down. First, she said it was in draft form. That has been contradicted by other people at the table, around that COAG table. She then said it was about a cost-benefit analysis. The communique did not indicate that it was a unanimous decision of those sitting around the table that they wanted to do further analysis. So what we've seen is excuses from Senator Nash. What I would like to see, and I think what Labor would like to see, is a full explanation. Unfortunately, what we saw this week in the Parliament is both Senator Nash and Tony Abbott dodging the questions, not answering the questions. I think what the Labor Party is calling for is a clear statement and enough of the secrecy. A bit more transparency would be very much, I think, appreciated by the Australian people.
OK, well, Tony Abbott told Parliament on Thursday that the Healthy Eating website was taken down because it wasn't ready yet. Do you believe him?
Oh, well, look, there's conflicting advice from other people that were in the meeting. I mean, Tony Abbott wasn't at the meeting of his ministerial counterparts, and there's conflicting views. Certainly there have been letters presented, certainly from the South Australian Minister for Health, that this was not his understanding of the meeting and that they did believe it was final and ready to go. Indeed, the Shadow Minister for Health was aware she'd seen the website and believed that it was ready to go. So it seems to me that there is a number of excuses around this, a number of changing reasons. As I said, Senator Nash presented a different reason later on in Senate proceedings. So I think what we really need is some transparency and actually a proper explanation. And I think the Shadow Minister has called for a proper ministerial statement announcing exactly what went on.
OK, now if we can turn to the economy, unemployment figures were released on Thursday showing that the jobless rate is up to 6%. Does Joe Hockey need to modify his budget strategy, less emphasis on getting the budget back into the black and more emphasis on protecting jobs?
Well, look, it is very, very concerning to see the unemployment figure rise like this. And the last time that figure was that high in Australian history was actually when Tony Abbott was Minister for Employment. What I'd like to see from the government is a plan around jobs. It's a plan around how they're going to create jobs, how they're going to encourage jobs and promote jobs. We have not seen anything from this government about that. They said that they believe that the automotive industry inevitably would shut. Where is their plan? We've had the Premier of South Australia put a very reasonable jobs plan on the table. Unfortunately, we have not seen the Prime Minister, Minister for Industry or the Treasurer really have a look at that seriously. So I think the government does need to seriously look at jobs and make that the focus. Unfortunately, what we hear from Joe Hockey constantly is huffing and puffing, things like the privatisation of Medicare, a whole range of things, but not a focus on jobs. And so I would call on the government really to start having that as the centrepiece of their budget and the centrepiece of what they're doing, because it is hurting people out there in the community.
Well, one way of stimulating the economy, of course, is to cut taxes. The government wants to cut the carbon tax. It has a direct action plan that would pour money out and help stimulate jobs. Why doesn't Labor support the abolition of the carbon tax, if not for climate policy reasons, for economic reasons?
Well, for economic reasons, direct action is not the way to go. Direct action is a lot of spending for not a lot of environmental outcome. When you're looking at the most efficient way to actually reduce carbon, you can't just say we will put money, and we've seen reports now already that businesses are asking for exemption from baseline figures and for direct action. We don't know what the government's going to do because we have heard nothing about direct action. We have seen Minister Hunt get up in the Parliament day after day talking nothing about his direct action plan. There's no proposal on the table for direct action. We have seen none of the architecture around it. So I think it's a little premature to say, why aren't you supporting direct action, when there is nothing in place and no evidence whatsoever that it's an economically efficient way to reduce carbon. But of course, while the government goes on about, reducing taxes, what we are going to see is an increase in the company tax for large companies in this country. We're going to see a levy to pay for their expensive paid parental leave. So it is a furphy for the government to be saying that they want to reduce taxes. We've also seen recently the reduction, the abolishment of a whole lot of small business incentives that were tax breaks for small business. The government has put those taxes back on. So what we're seeing is a lot of rhetoric from Joe Hockey about taxes, but really no action, indeed, putting on more taxes.
Okay, and just finally, the government has expected that former Howard Government Minister Nick Minchin will be the next Consul General in New York. That's a pretty good move, isn't he? He's a very experienced man, wide experience in the finance portfolio. A good appointment?
Well, look, Nick Minchin, I think, has had a very good career in Parliament. He's a South Australian, and we always like South Australians promoting South Australia. I would say, though, the government, as the process to this point, and this is not about Nick Minchin, but the process has been quite partisan in the way that they've dealt with this appointment, and probably quite. We've had that vacancy now in New York, I understand, for 5 months. That is not the right way, and pretty disorderly to actually have our second most senior person in the United States not properly represented for the last 5 months. So it has been a mess to get to this point from the government, and quite partisan and party political, I think. But I certainly wish Nick Minchin the best in New York, and really ask him to promote South Australia in New York, because we've got great wine, great food, and I'm sure no doubt he will do that.
Okay, Amanda Rishworth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Just a few short weeks ago, Treasurer Joe Hockey was talking tough, declaring an end to the age of entitlement and foreshadowing a tough budget. But this week his job got a whole lot harder. On Monday, Toyota declared that it was going to cease making cars in Australia from 2017. Midweek, the mining services company Forge went into administration with a cost of something like 1,300 jobs. And then on Thursday, the unemployment figures came out, showing that the jobless rate had hit 6%, the highest rate in a decade. So in framing the budget, Joe Hockey has a problem. Does he continue to try and cut back spending as much as possible to achieve a surplus as soon as possible, or does he leave some stimulation in there to keep the jobless rate under control? Well, to discuss that and other issues, I'm joined by two of Fairfax's finest, political correspondent Heath Aston and chief political correspondent Mark Kenny. Mark, to you first. Any signs during the past week that Joe Hockey may be changing his position at all?
Well, I think what we're seeing from Joe Hockey is a kind of a framing exercise in rhetorical terms, but we do see different rhetoric coming from him than was the case a little while ago. As you mentioned in your introduction, it was a good summary, I think, of the journey he's been on, because before it was all about fiscal consolidation, about fixing up the mess. You've got to remember this government was elected on the basis of endlessly talking up a budget crisis, that it all had to be fixed very quickly, and that was the chief priority for the government. Since then we've seen a raft of economic conditions change. We know that circumstances in which this budget are being framed are difficult anyway, but as you have just listed, the changes that we've seen lately, the new data, the jobs being shared in various companies, the fact the jobless rate is going higher, and the outlook for the Australian economy mean that it's a very difficult budget to frame, and Hockey is now talking about focusing the budget on growth. He hasn't used those terms before, but he said this budget will be focused on growth. Now, I asked him in the press conference whether that meant it would be stimulatory, bearing in mind the sort of jihad really that the then opposition ran against the Labor government about stimulus spending and so forth. He balked at that. He didn't want to use the term stimulatory, but he is talking about a budget that is going to be very conscious of not doing harm to fragile growth in this country, and presumably, hopefully, not getting the jobless rate going higher.
So, Heath, do you think there's a danger here of the government being hoisted on its own petard? You know, it made such a big thing about the surplus when it was in opposition. And of course we saw Wayne Swan and Labor get into so much problems in promising a surplus by a certain date. Do you think now that the government's facing the same sort of problems?
Yeah, I think there's a very fine line here where they're promising everything has to be framed around just getting the settings of the economy right, and no intervention into industry, but they're doing it at a time where the economy appears to be set for a rough patch coming up. So there's a lot of dangers there for Joe Hockey in taking a very purist line, but also there's the upcoming seems to be a lot of problems ahead. So yeah.
Yeah, the economists will tell us that there's all these sort of specific parameters and levers that you can adjust, but the sort of the one that's unpredictable is confidence and business confidence, and that must have taken a blow this week. So do you think that Hockey, in shaping his rhetoric, is trying to promote a bit of confidence?
I think so. I think, as Mark said, he's softened his line somewhat on the savageness of what might be in the budget. So. And also maybe a little bit softer rhetoric in terms of Qantas. So yeah, I think that there's certainly that's what he needs to do. Yes.
Now, Mark, a few weeks ago, Joe Hockey was saying no more corporate welfare. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce was in Canberra during the past week seeking assistance for Qantas. Now, not a big bag of money. What's the government's position on Qantas looking like developing into it?
Well, it is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've seen the rebuff that was given to SPC Ardmona. They wanted $25 million and didn't get it. We know that the car industry has now all three players have announced they're leaving, and many people will blame the government for not having done more. And so Hockey's been very strong arguing on this line that the government's not about propping up businesses. Businesses need to be responsible for themselves. However, Qantas is a special case, and the Treasurer is already, like, he hasn't announced anything specifically yet, but he's very clearly positioning to provide some sort of assistance to Qantas. He's arguing that it has exceptional circumstances. It's the national carrier. It faces competition from Virgin, which has the backing of 3 other airlines, all of which have the backing of governments. So in the sense, Virgin has sort of sovereign backing. He's arguing that the Qantas Sale Act is like a straitjacket, which means that it can't compete in an open way and can't raise capital in an open way on the international market and so forth. And so he's saying something needs to be done. Now, they're not going to get the change of the Sale Act through. They're not going to get a change to the law which allows Qantas to be majority foreign owned, for example. But it does look like Qantas is going to be given the other thing that it's been seeking, which is a government guarantee. Not so long ago, Qantas was an investment-grade airline. There were hardly any of them.
It was the last one.
Yeah, and it's now technically junk status. So its credit rating has effectively gone, and what Qantas is seeking from the government is the backing of the sovereign, the backing of the Commonwealth of Australia to borrow money and therefore rebuild its credit position. And it looks like that's what the government's going to do.
And the advantage there is that it pays a lot less interest on its borrowings.
Yeah, the advantage is that it pays less interest on its borrowings, and that it's seen as a much safer bet, because effectively you can't do your dough if you invest in if you lend money to the airline. Then you know that if everything goes pear-shaped, that the Commonwealth will come in and back it up, and of course that allows the airline to rebuild its credit rating as well. But of course the big contradiction here that this all raises is, well, where is the end of entitlement? Where is the end of corporate welfare if in fact the government's doing this? Now, the way I think the government's going to argue this, the way Hockey's going to justify it, is that it will eventually be done on a sort of a commercial basis. That is, we, the Commonwealth, will underwrite you, Qantas, but you will pay for it. You will pay for it by way of, the equivalent of an insurance premium. Now, that was the case for the banks, you might recall, during the GFC, when the banks were underwritten and they paid for the government guarantee that they got. So it looks like that's the kind of thing that's going to be done. And I think that will allow Hockey at least to argue that this is a sort of a commercial transaction, and that actually technically, assuming we don't have to pay out on those debts, that the taxpayer ends up with more coin in the pocket.
So if the government is shifting a bit of its ground on so-called corporate welfare, I noticed that Tony Abbott this morning on Neil Mitchell on 3AW was saying that the assistance package for Holden workers may be expanded. So one may expect perhaps any package for Toyota workers would be also generous. So it looks like the government is wanting to appear a bit more caring.
Yeah, and I think they probably need to. And as you say, if they're doing it for Holden, then obviously they'll have to do it for Toyota and Ford as well. Like we were saying, it's a fine line between what their objectives of looking very liberal and purist and strong on where they want to be on assistance and on promoting, setting the levers in the economy. But with Bill Shorten aiming his attack purely on they don't care about jobs, there's going to obviously have to be a little bit of give from the government in squaring that off, so that doesn't become too much of a potent attack for the opposition, which appears to think, and Bill Shorten sort of confirmed this week that that's where they're going on. This is a government that doesn't care about jobs. So there's actually quite a line being sort of drawn between the two on that in that regard. You'd
have to imagine that they're getting feedback both through their MPs, possibly through some of the qualitative polling that parties do, that the government's looking pretty hard-nosed at the moment. Now, the government wants to project that image in a sense. That's what the whole end of entitlement speech was all about. But it doesn't want to appear both hard and heartless. Because that's death in politics, of course. You need to understand the plight of your electors and so forth. There are lots of people who are feeling very nervous at the moment. You mentioned business confidence before. business confidence hasn't been bad, but it will be interesting to see which way it goes as a result of this spate of closures and all the pressure that's in the economy at the moment, and the projections of 6.5% unemployment, as we've reported today on Friday in the Fairfax papers on the part of some economists. So the government does need to lay down these markers, and it is going to be a tough business sort of changing the mindset of many people in the community and in corporate Australia in terms of government handouts. But at the same time, I think the government needs to, whilst doing that, appear like it cares about people caught in the transition, because it's the people in the transition from where the economy is now to where this government wants to take it that need to be assisted through.
And Mark, during the week, the Treasurer gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal in which he more or less announced that there were $130 billion worth of government assets in Australia that could be privatised, and he's made the argument that would free up money to invest in new infrastructure. Now, of course, many of those government-owned assets aren't owned by the federal government, they're owned by state governments. He made that announcement. The interview in the newspaper, I interviewed Andrew Broad, a National Party member who went, hands off Snowy Hydro, don't even think about Australia Post. Is Joe Hockey going to fight a battle on another front here with his National Party colleagues?
Well, I think he probably is. There's going to be a fair amount of resistance to this. There always is when you sell off government assets. But I think what Hockey's trying to do here, and I think many people would applaud him for this, is start this debate and start it at the right place. Which is the positive public policy outcome that you can get from this. What he's trying to say is, look, governments all around the world are out of cash. Governments are revenue strapped, and it's well known. But in the private sector, and even in Australia, within the Australian business community, there are accounts full of cash. There are superannuation funds in Australia, for example, that have a lot of money that can be productively invested, and a lot of that money at the moment is being productively invested offshore. So what he's really saying is, there is value for the taxpayer here in turning over these assets. Assets that have been on the books of the public for a long time can be sold, and that money then recycled into the construction of new infrastructure, new economy building infrastructure. And I think that's a really solid message. But as you quite rightly identify, in the general, that's a great idea, but in the particular, you just end up with fights all over the place. And of course, within the coalition, that could mean fights, of course.
And he definitely has one coming with Barry O'Farrell, it seems, this week. The Premier of New South Wales said that he basically confirmed that he doesn't want to sell the poles and wires. That's where most of the money is for New South Wales, and also Joe Hockey must have his eye on it. It's worth $30 billion. But O'Farrell's seen Labor premiers go down over the issue of privatising electricity in New South Wales. He sees the danger. He's also got pressure from within the coalition inside New South Wales. The Nats don't want to sell the poles and wires. So how Joe Hockey navigates a way through the states and getting them on board to sell these things and unlock that money is a massive challenge.
It's always fun watching the sort of gap between the federal Liberals and the state Liberals when it comes to the sort of application of policy purity. We saw it in the case of SPC, where one government obviously is facing the electors this year, and one isn't. That being the Victorian government is facing the electors, and so they've bailed out SPC, as happened on Thursday, $22 million thrown into the kitty after the Commonwealth wouldn't do it. And it's the same in the case that you're talking about, electricity infrastructure. It's a great idea. It's consistent with Liberal principle, but Barry O'Farrell is living on the ground in New South Wales, and the political dangers for him are too great.
I guess that's the other thing that would occupy Joe Hockey's thoughts. As you say, a Victorian government facing an election finds it difficult to make a hard economic decision. But Joe Hockey, if you can't make the really hard economic decisions in your first budget, when can you make them?
Too right. And that's, of course, the problem for him. That's always been his guiding logic, I think. To the government's credit, it actually did have a plan to do a whole bunch of really tough things in the first year. And I think there still will be some tough things, but they are definitely backpedalling a bit. They are definitely, at the moment, retreating from some of those things because they literally just can't afford to damage the economy.
And Joe Hockey said yesterday in his press conference, we need to get this done quick. So there was the signal there from him, and he was probably talking more about himself needing to get it done quick than states, because they'll take a while to come on board. But definitely in the cycle of it, and with what he'll be receiving, I think today from the Commission of Audit will be recommending to sell all those assets that he's talking about. So he must know already where the Commission of Audit is heading with its recommendations, which is to unlock all that money and recycle it into new infrastructure.
Okay, Heath Aston, Mark Kenny, thank you so much for your insights.
Good on you,
Thank
Chris.
you.
And that's Breaking Politics for another day and another week. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday.